Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Design News webinar, Connected Health, the Miniaturization of Medical, Part 2, sponsored by Accumold, Maxon, Performance Motion Devices, and broadcast by Informa. I'm Chris Keach, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few brief announcements before we begin. First, this webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in our Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. Please note that we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A session at the end of today's program. If we're unable to get to your individual question today, someone will get back to you after the program is over. Also, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you may also download a copy of the slides via the Resources widget. And towards the end of the webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click on the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen or type your issue into the Q&A text area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. And now on to the presentation, Connected Health, the Miniaturization of Medical, Part 2. Moderating today's discussion is Chuck Murray, contributing editor, Design News. And discussing today's topic are Aaron Johnson, VP Marketing and Customer Strategy at Accumold, Karsten Horn, Business Development Engineer, Maxon Motors, and Prab Gaurisankaran, VP Engineering and Strategy, Performance Motion Devices. To learn more about today's speakers, please visit the Bios widget. It's with great pleasure I now turn this special session over to Chuck to begin. Chuck, take it away.
Okay, so in today's webinar, we're going to examine how the use of miniaturized medical components is improving healthcare and creating better patient diagnostics. We're going to talk about the reasons for medical miniaturization. We're going to discuss why it's good for patients, but mainly we're going to look at the design and manufacturing challenges that are coming up in miniaturization. So we move on to slide 5 here. We're going to look at miniaturization from 3 perspectives, which together give us a good overview. To start, we'll discuss molding of miniaturized parts. Our expert on this is Accumold, which is an Iowa-based company that does injection molding on a micro scale. Accumold provides in-house mold design, mold fabrication, and molding all under one roof. And wait till you see the size of some of these parts that we're talking about. As small as 800 microns. We'll show you that later in our presentation. Next, we'll also look at micro motors. Here we have a great compilation of images from Maxon Group. Maxon produces DC and brushless DC motors, as well as gear heads, sensors, and controllers. And as you can imagine, the size of the motor matters, especially if you have to put that motor through a catheter and insert it into the human body. Finally, we will discuss the use of motion performance systems for these types of application, as well as robotic applications. Our expert here will be Performance Motion Devices, which creates integrated circuit modules and boards that control the automated motion that we're going to be talking about here today. So let's move on here to a little bit of history. Let's start with a little history. Here we have about a century-old piece of history, and we're going to go back and look at this. What we want to show here is the way medical technology has evolved over the past century and how this move to miniaturization is really not all that new. So what we have here is the original, believe it or not, the original electrocardiogram. As we know, electrocardiogram is basically a graph of the heart's electrical activity, voltage versus time. Here's an image from 1911 showing how the electrodes are attached to the patient, who actually had to keep both hands and one foot immersed in jars of salt solution. Note here that the electrical systems used in this electrocardiogram take up about half of a small room. We move on here to another look backwards. This is an early insulin pump, and really this is not all that old. Insulin pumps are used for the administration of insulin to diabetes patients. This one is from the early 1960s. In 1963, Dr. Arnold Kadish designed the first insulin pump, and it was actually worn as a backpack. So today we're familiar with implantable pacemakers, but here you have one that came before the implantable days. Again, it's not that long ago, mid-1950s, and as you can probably make out, the photo's a little blurry, but this one is cart-based, and you can see a man in his pajamas pushing the cart here. That is the way pacemakers worked about 65 years ago. The first pacemaker, which was invented in 1952, was a large tabletop unit, and it had a big chest electrode. It successfully resuscitated patients, but it also required delivery of as much as 150 volts, which was very painful, incredibly painful for children. And here we have the pacemaker's cousin, the defibrillator. The one shown here is in a Japanese subway station, and this one is modern. Obviously, we still need external defibrillators like this one, but the reason I showed the photo here is there was a time, not all that long ago, all the way up into the 1980s, when external defibrillators like this were all that was available. Around that time, and again, mid to late 80s, the implantable defibrillator was invented, but it was still big and bulky, and it was only capable of delivering one stage of treatment. And that stage was a massive electrical wallop of about 720 volts. Before those early implantable units would go off, they would warn the patient by sounding a buzzer so that the patient would have time to get down on their hands and knees before the therapy hit them. So patients obviously were terrified of these episodes. Some of them banded together in support groups, and they even asked their cardiologist to remove them, preferring the risk of death over the actual therapy itself. So now we've taken a little glimpse of the past, so let's move up to current day technology. Most of us recognize this. It's an electrocardiograph that millions of hospitals and doctors' offices use. It provides a graph of the heart's electrical activity. Again, it's voltage versus time, but this one does so without the buckets of saline solution that we saw a few slides earlier. And this is a time-tested technology, and it's considered the gold standard of electrocardiographs. But now we move on to the more portable type of cardiac monitoring, and this is today and going forward. Wireless units like this one can send the electrocardiogram to a wearable monitor or even to a smartphone, which is what we're showing here. I believe we're now seeing TV commercials that are showing phone apps with that kind of capability. And they can record events that could occur during activity, which obviously a cart-based unit can't do. You can't run with a cart-based electrocardiogram next to you. We move on here to this is another example of miniaturization in electrocardiograms. This one is called the iRhythm Zeo, and it provides up to 14 days of uninterrupted cardiac monitoring. This, by the way, is a replacement for what's called the Holter monitor today. Moving on, we have the insulin pump. This is what the insulin pump has evolved into. This is a difficult photo to see, but this is called the Yipso pump, and it's made by a Swiss manufacturer, Yipsomed. It injects precisely defined amount of insulin into the patient's fatty tissue through a thin needle, which you can't see here. But the benefit is that diabetics don't need to inject themselves several times a day. Instead, they only have to change the hose with the needle every few days. It weighs a little under 80 grams, so compare that to the slide you saw earlier that goes in a backpack. And it communicates with a notebook computer or a smartphone. The pump's drive uses a flat Maxon motor, so we'll be probably talking about that a little later. So here you have the modern-day pacemaker. This is a far cry from the tabletop units of the early 1950s that we saw earlier. The evolution from AC-based tabletop units to battery-powered systems actually occurred pretty quickly. Earl Bakken, an electrical engineer who was part of a two-person company called Medtronic, Inc., was asked by physicians at the University Hospital in Minnesota to design a battery backup for their AC-based pacemaker system back in 1957, and the first recipient of this was in 1958. So that was our first implantable pacemaker, and here is the first recipient. And I included this. I like this slide, I like this story. I put it in because it tells a lot about the life-saving value of the pacemaker, and it tells us about the speed of its evolution. Arne Larsen became the first person to receive an implantable pacemaker in 1958, and he lived all the way to 2001 with it, 43 years. And here's an amazing statistic. He had 26 of these devices implanted in him during those 43 years. And that tells us a lot about the evolution of the technology. Rather than simply replacing a battery, the physicians were always implanting a newer and better unit. So Larsen was said to be a great advocate and a great spokesman for the value of the implantable pacemaker. And here we move on with a little more of the miniaturization trend. This is an implantable defibrillator, the modern-day cousin of the pacemaker. But this one is actually more than just a defibrillator, and that's what's important. It's a cardioverter defibrillator, and it has 3 stages rather than just one. Remember that we mentioned how the single-stage defibrillator was terrifying its recipients, many of whom preferred the risk of death to the therapy. Well, the shrinkage of the electronic components set the stage for the introduction of 2 more stages of therapy. The first stage was almost imperceptible for the patient. It was a very low voltage, and the second stage was a little stronger, but still not unpleasant. And here's the key. Most cardiac events could be resolved without going to the third stage, the one that was scaring the patients. So the implantable cardioverter defibrillator came out in the early 1990s, wasn't that long ago, but without the miniaturization, we would not have had 3 stages in one unit, and therefore implantable defibrillators would not be used as regularly as they are now. Now here, I love this story. More about the miniaturization trend. This is another example of how miniaturization saves lives. This is called the CareLink monitor, and if you look at the photo, you can see it there in the foreground on the nightstand. Because electronics kept shrinking, the engineers were able to squeeze a wireless transceiver into the body of the implantable defibrillator, and that enabled the defibrillator to talk to this CareLink monitor that we see on the nightstand. So when the defibrillator recognizes a serious cardiac event, it's able to talk to the monitor, which then calls the doctor or the hospital. So here's the part about this story that I love. So about 10 years ago, I talked to a patient who was awakened by a knock on his door in the middle of the night, and it was 2 paramedics, and they had come to his home to tell him that he needed to get to the emergency room. They took him to the emergency room. It saved his life, and that couldn't have happened if engineers wouldn't have squeezed that wireless transceiver into his defibrillator. So I'm just going to look real briefly here at 3 trends, 3 examples of miniaturization, and I'll just touch on them real fast. But the first of those is the arthroscope, which is a form of an endoscope. It has changed medicine, again, thanks to miniaturization. Arthroscopes enable a surgeon to go into the body through a tiny incision, and they're used for a lot of things. What we're seeing here is the repair of knee meniscus, but they are also used in the surgery of hips, shoulders, wrists, and spines. And I'm willing to bet that between 1/3 and 1/2 of our listeners have had some type of arthroscopic surgery. It's that popular. So the miniaturization trend moves on here. We have laparoscopic surgery. Laparoscopic surgery is another example of how it's changed medicine. Instead of surgeons making a major incision that would call for weeks of recovery, laparoscopic surgery enables them to do major interventions with only a small cut or cuts to the abdomen. The key invention is the laparoscope, which is a long fiber optic cable that allows viewing of the affected area by snaking the cable from a remote location. And finally, we also have the robotic surgery, and I mention that because all of our speakers here today have been involved in one way or another in robotic systems. Here's a robotic laparoscopic system, which is more commonly being used now because it offers precision benefits and visual advantages. Now we move on to the challenges. And let's look at this for a minute. You have to really look at this penny. In the middle of the penny, you see a black speck. So the first challenge is sheer size. Sometimes the parts for these miniaturized systems are really unbelievably tiny. That little speck in the center of the penny is what's called an alignment spacer, and it's used in a laser photonics package. Accumold describes this as the last little piece puzzle for an incredibly small device. And it should be mentioned that this part is 800 microns long. To put that another way, that's about 3/100ths of an inch long. Again, miniaturization challenge here. This is called an EC6. It's a brushless DC motor, and it's the second smallest drive in the Maxon family. This is employed in a catheter-based circulation assist device for heart failure patients, and it's called the aortics. And now we're going to show you what the aortics looks like. There it is. And that motor we just saw goes inside there. Here's the aortics device. It's basically a small continuous flow pump, and it's built by a company called Procerion. And it measures about 6 millimeters in diameter. That's about 1/4 of an inch. And that's why the Maxon motor that we showed you in the last slide had to be so small. Aortics accelerates a portion of the blood's native blood flow and pushes it downstream. That's the job it has to do. We're also going to look today at small ICs. So here's a small IC which enables engineers to incorporate a complicated motion profile in a tiny medical device that uses a brushless DC or brush-type DC or a stepper motor. Shown here we have the Juno motion control IC. Those are targeted at velocity and torque control applications, and it's been used on infusion pumps and on ventilators. This slide depicts one of the other challenges that are constantly facing engineers to make assemblies smaller. They need to consolidate parts. Here, Accumold shows how it consolidates through material replacement. In this example, the original part had a metal tube running through the center. Accumold was able to mold the tube and the larger hub, that's what's at the base there, into one all-plastic part. And this part is a connector hub for a surgical tool. And the advantage here is not just miniaturization, but it's about manufacturing process reduction, because we've taken two parts and made them into one. On to the next slide. Here's an implantable pump system, which is designed to reside inside a person's abdomen. It's called the Alpha pump, and it's made by Sequana Medical. This pump has a lot of parts, including a lithium-ion battery and a Maxon EC13 motor, which drives the pump's gears. And once again here, this could not be done without miniaturization, because the unit you're looking at here has to hold the pump, the motor, the gears, the electronics, and the lithium-ion battery. Okay, so here what you're seeing is an example of parts consolidation. The photo doesn't do it justice because I wasn't able to put the call-outs on this photo, but I'll try to explain it here. This is a hearing aid chassis, and it's just 1.5 inches long. But look at the detail on this part. At the bottom right there, you've got an insert. At the top left, you have 2 more inserts for a battery contact. They're all integrated into a larger piece. At the bottom middle, you have a very thin wall design, and the entire top piece is an example of multi-part consolidation. Again, the idea is here is that we're not just making it small, but we're integrating several parts into one, so we have process reduction. Okay, this is an operating room needle that needs to be flexible to make its way into the deep recesses of the brain where it injects medication. It has to be flexible because a rigid tool would run the risk of damaging healthy brain tissue. So the overall diameter of this tool is just 2.5 millimeters, or about 1/10 of an inch. The tool uses a motor, gearhead, and controller. So there's a Maxon EC20 flat motor and the planetary gearhead and the controller, and they all enable it to go into the brain without damaging any healthy tissue. Okay, once again, back to ICs here. In this photo, we see the N-series ion drive motion control IC from PMD. This measures about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches by about 2/3 of an inch. It's aimed at medical devices that need power, connectivity, high-performance motion control. PMD has used this on machines such as DNA sequencing systems, lab automation equipment, and multi-axis pipette control. So before we move on to our speakers, there's one area of medical product development that I thought we should not overlook, and that's the process of FDA approval. Most engineers in the medical field have known this challenge very well. What you see here is the FDA documentation for Medtronic's first implantable defibrillator. This is actually a story taken from DesignNews. This is the company's pre-market approval submission. And if you take a good look, you can see the stack of paper is taller than the regulatory manager who is posing with it in the picture there. Medtronic submitted 6 copies of the application, each copy containing 3,000 pages and weighing 41 pounds. Okay, let's move on to our speakers here. Let's start with Aaron. Aaron, this is Aaron from Accumold, Aaron Johnson. What are the challenges in micromolding?
Thanks, Chuck, and hello, everybody. One of the things that we find our customers, design engineers, after most in the miniaturization challenge is doing more in the same space or more and less. And you look back at the history of the products and things that Chuck has showed. All of that, the smaller and smaller you go, tends to put pressure on your current manufacturing processes, and you start hitting some roadblocks. And you think about the consolidation of the form factors and what you're trying to do. And so micromolding has become one of those enabling technologies that helps in that miniaturization trend almost get out of the way of the function or even provide some functionality in the device itself with some of that part consolidation you mentioned. And the consolidation not only helps with the manufacturing process, but it also, when you're taking 2 parts and putting them together, oftentimes you can share wall stock between 2 adjacent parts and giving yourself that much more room. And sometimes, every little bit helps, looking at the overall device and figuring out maybe a more complex part, but it might allow some consolidation to create that space. So when you're looking to do more in the same space or more and less, you have to find every avenue there. And then, of course, you're pushing the limits of the material itself and trying to match those together. And there's a kind of a whole art to the design for micromolding. And really, what the bottom line is that if you're struggling with a project, your supply chain is saying, no, that's too small, find a good micromold partner that you can have that design for micromolding conversation with, because it can open up a lot of doors that you might not necessarily think were available. Okay,
so move on here to Karsten Horn of Maxon Group. Different challenges here, obviously, Karsten. What are the challenges in the implementation of micromotors in medical?
Yeah, thank you, Chuck, for that question, and hello, everybody online. Chuck, that's a very good question, but unfortunately, I can't give you a very simple answer, as there's not an answer that fit all the requirements. Typical-wise, we divide that in a little bit in 2 major groups. One is when we talk about incorporeal or in-body stuff out there, and one that is excorporeal. If you go in-body, then typical-wise, you have one major challenge, and that's an enemy, that's the temperature. And every micromotor or every electromechanical or electromagnetical system will generate heat. And that's based on efficiency out there. And we can push, of course, the limits, but every scaling factor will bring you down. The smaller you go, the power that you can get out of a drive is going down by a larger factor. For example, if you have a 6mm motor, you can get out there like 0.8 watt per millimeter. That's about the power density that is possible. If you go only 2 millimeters smaller, say from 6 to 4 millimeters, this value dropped to 0.064 watt per millimeter. And by that, you can already see how big that is of a challenge. As you know, typical-wise, every application needs a certain sort of power out there. So there are limits out there. You can compensate that in a certain area, in a certain manner, but that typically means you need to understand very precisely your application. And this is true for every electromechanical unit out there. So you need to understand which torque, if we talk about a rotational motion out there, you need to understand exactly the torque, the speed you need, and the precise duty cycle. Or if it's a linear, you need to understand the forces, the waves, and of course also the duty cycle very precisely. Then you have some technologies that you can use and optimize your drive for these working points or for this assembly or working points there to get the most efficient drive out there. So we optimize that for the losses that you have. Because you can imagine if you have too much temperature in body, what is happening then, it's getting critical, especially if it is in blood or something like that, and you go over this famous 40 degrees C, you are in trouble already, because then you start destroying some of the cells out there and build up stuff. It's a little bit different story if you're ex-corporal. If you have something, for example, like an ambulatory device. For example, you have shown that insulin pump out there. That's something you carry around. And then the question is more on the comfort side. And comfort means, can I go swimming with this thing? Does it bother me? So how small it is more a question of comfort. Again, of course, then you would try to optimize it to size, but maybe efficiency is not the part that is the most important part, or temperature losses are not the most important part. It's more that the size is getting small, and that efficiency, yeah, as long as the battery can take it and it's not making the unit heavy, it will be optimized in that direction. If you know exactly your duty cycle and what you need on forces, torques, and anything, and how this is looking, then you can also optimize it for this sort of applications. And that's typical-wise what we see on micromotors and implementing them. Following the physics, and yeah, you know, physics obviously is our enemy sometimes because we can't trick them. On the other hand, they also help us in different ways.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Karsten. Let's move on to Prab, kind of with the same question here, Prab. What are the challenges to implementing motion in miniature medical devices?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck, for that question. And similar to what Aaron and Carson mentioned, typically the focus is on small form factor, but what they don't realize is you also need like low power, heat dissipation becomes critical, like Carson was talking about, and all this boils down to getting the motor to spin smoothly. So even though they want it to be a smaller form factor, they need all the advanced motion control techniques to kind of get it to the sweet spot where it's consuming less power and kind of make the motor spin smoother. But what I've seen typically is their focus or their expertise is on solving the medical problems, right? So they tend to they want to look for a motion partner that has experience in this area, so you can at least guide them into different things that previous customers have found, issues that they've seen, and try to apply advanced motion control techniques to solving their problem. So it helps them with some design freedom. As in one example, they didn't realize they had more flexibility than they thought, like to what Aaron talked about with micromolding, and Carson with Maxon with the micromotors. Combining all of them together is a challenge that it's more, they need guidance and a trusted partner to kind of take them through the flow. And give them advice on the choices they have. So that's typically what I've seen in terms of challenges on the motion side.
Okay, thank you, Prab. We're going to go back now to Aaron, and we're going to discuss something that probably everybody has to be concerned with. I mean, where do you get started and how do you get started? So what do engineers need to get started with molding of miniature medical components?
That's a great question, and the first thing the first advice I have is don't give up. We tell our customers all the time, start with your ideal, start what you think you need to have to be successful. But there's a lot of roadblocks that kind of can get in the way if you're following a traditional injection molding path. First off, it is injection molding, and that's key to know that you have to design a part that can open and close if you've got slides and core pulls and undercuts and things like that, but those rules still do apply. But often what we find is that the form factor designs are maybe smaller than the traditional supply chain is used to dealing with. You might go to a resin vendor and say, hey, I want to use this material. What do you recommend for this part? And they say, that material won't work with that part. Or you might use a mold flow analysis, and it'll tell you, nope, that part isn't moldable. You know, from our experience of 35 years of micromolding, long before mold flow used to tell us that we couldn't have existed for 25 years. And so we know that there are ways to process and to build the tools that can accomplish some pretty fantastic things when it comes to micro-miniaturization. And so it's back to what Prab alluded to in finding those trusted partners and starting with the conversation with, in this case, you know, a micromolder that has the experience in knowing where to push those limits of thin wall applications, the materials that go together well in those spaces, and what you can and can't do. I mean, there is a limit, but sometimes it's beyond maybe what the normal process might allow. So don't give up and pursue what you can till the very end, and you might find that you have an opportunity for a breakthrough.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Aaron. Let's move back to Karsten. Same question, and I guess the question to add to it a little bit is what do they need to know to get started with micromotors?
All right. Yes. As I mentioned before, you know, the big question is you need to understand your application very precisely. And you need to understand your duty cycle. And sometimes it is a very good idea to start with something, for example, off the shelf, and try to really understand the duty cycle by measuring it. So we use very often some of our standard components for that you can get from stock very quickly, and then you start measuring into it, and then start to understand really your duty cycle. And then there's a little bit often a misleading in when you take a look on motors and try to understand them. Typically, many people look on the wattage of a motor. It tells you, wow, this motor has 1 watt, for example, or 5 watt out there. There's no standard in the world that how you declare or specify your motors on that one. So this is always a question then how this 1 watt is measured and how you can understand that. What is always the product of speed and torque, typical wise on a motor. And if you have 1 watt there, this is typical wise. I can tell from Maxon that it is the thermal limit. So if you screw a motor to a plastic or to a polymer washer out there so that it is thermal isolated, you can drive out of that motor 1 watt mechanical power on the output side. That is how it is determined. That doesn't mean that you can get 20 watt out of the same motor. Of course, only for a short time. For a very short time sometimes if you go crazy with that. But it's the trick how you can typical wise design your motors. And if you understand your application, you can easily overdrive this sort of motors like crazy and still work in your application. That's one of the important things to get things small, to get your drive small. You know, the last, I think, 15, 20 years, we had some major driving factors for getting things small, and everyone in our business realized that. So it was the magnetic material. the development of the magnetic material, especially the energy density that you get in there, made it possible to make smaller stuff with higher power density. And this factor was driving all other components. You see it on the electronic side. You need to get high currents in very small size devices to get motor position controllers possible that are only a fraction of a millimeter in size, or a few millimeters in size, depending really what it is. Also on the gearbox side, you now have torques on small units that will never be possible before. So this is driving the gear technology. And this is driving us, of course, for the future. And if you want to get started and want to get really small, really try to understand your application precisely. And then our engineers can help you with sizing this thing in the right way to make it as small as possible.
Okay, thank you, Karsten. We're going to move on now. Same question again. Prab, what do engineers need to know to employ motion in miniature medical devices?
Yeah, typically the starting point is we sell a lot of ICs. So the starting point is trying to create your own design because you have a unique form factor. So you want to try to migrate to the smallest ICs you can find. For example, we have a full functioning motion controller in a 56-pin VQFN. It's like a 10 by 10 millimeter. It's a pretty small chip. But one thing they don't realize is they need a little bit of more sophisticated motion control techniques, such as FOC, current control, S-curve profiles and stuff. It's not that they use it all the time. It's more to optimize their performance, because once you get smaller, like Carson mentioned with the micromotors, the challenge is how do you get the maximum performance from a smaller motor. So there's different varied challenges there. So the key is trying to understand, like I talked about before, motion is not their core expertise. So us trying to work with them to identify what features they need and kind of tuning their application. So what we typically tend to do is, like Carson mentioned, we ship them a developer kit, which helps them kind of prototype it on the desk with the motor they picked and kind of profile everything. And then the next step they do is miniaturizing it. So first step is getting to an end solution quicker, so the hardware side, the mechanical, and the software guys can go in parallel with existing cards we provide, and then trying to create your own card. As an example, we've seen where we worked with customers to create a size of a finger, a card which it's a full-blown motion controller with a discrete amplifier and with an optical encoder. So there's techniques to kind of make it smaller. First is challenges to kind of identify your problem set, prototype it with a existing solution, and then doing the third step of miniaturizing it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Prab. All right. At this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris.
All right, well, thank you, Chuck. And now, before we begin with today's Q&A, please direct your attention to our webinar survey available on the right-hand side of the presentation window. If you close the survey, you can reopen it by clicking on the widget on the icon along the bottom of your screen. And thank you in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in this survey will allow us to better serve you on webinars in the future. We're now going to move on to the question and answer portion of our event. As a reminder, if you'd like to participate in our Q&A session, simply type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, type your question in, and then click the submit button. Please note that we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have left. If we are unable to get to your individual question today, someone will get back to you after the program is over. So I'll turn things back over to you, Chuck, for our question and answer session.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm taking a look at these questions here. Why don't we start out with this one? We got quite a few already. Aaron, what kinds of materials do you process?
That's a good question. As an injection molder, I think the last time I looked, there's over 80,000 different kinds of materials out there. We tend to focus on the engineering-based resins, the more sophisticated implantable or medical grade or optical grade type materials. But technically, you can injection mold just about any of those materials, or we can in the micro arena. What's important to note, though, when you're pushing the limits with micro features, the material and the geometry go hand in hand, and so it'll be very important to have that conversation very early on. If you're trying to mold something with a very thin, high aspect ratio, an LCP might work great, and PEEK maybe not so much. So those things go to hand in hand. So, materials like PEEK, like PEI, nylons, polycarbonates, acrylics, all sorts of fantastic materials that are available for micromolding. You just got to match them with the geometry is one of the most important parts.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Another question here. We're going to direct this one to Karsten. What are the trends in motor and drive development for medical products? What trends are you seeing, Karsten?
Yeah, there's one major trend from a technical point of view that is higher power density. That means that you want to increase the power per cubic millimeter of drivetrain. And that's true for motors, and that's also true for gearboxes and electronics, encoders, you name it. We have worked on that for the last years, and there's big improvements have been made out there. That's one of the major trends you see. Typical-wise, there's before we had been only the option to go with to generate higher power out of a motor when going with higher speeds. As I told you, torque by speed is power. So we were driving things when you go smaller in speeds like 100,000, 200,000 RPM to get it into usable power out there. This has some downsides. This is not easy anymore from an electronic point of view to commutate these motors or to control them. And also to get the efficiency still high there. That is limited out there because the losses always go up with the speeds you have down there. Also from a gearbox point of view, component point of view, it was also challenging out there because unfortunately now motors you can maybe get to a 90 or 95% efficiency if you know the working point precisely, but the gearbox technology didn't give that. So then probably the problem moved from the motor away to the gearboxes. We have seen this over the last years while the motor improved, the gearbox hadn't really so much. So that has gone a big push in that direction. So nowadays you see really high efficient gearboxes that you can find on the market or also from us. That is named, for example, ultra power, where you have efficiency per stages from around about 95, 96%. That's what you can see there. That's a big improvement out there. The other big development in this market is the delivery times. Nowadays, as we talked before, so Rob told that and Aaron, you need to make something simple first for samples to understand your application. And for that, you need to have very quickly something that fits for your application. And the delivery times need to go down in something that is a medium customized stuff. And that's another mega trend we have seen over the years, and we had to take an action on to try to solve this for our customers.
Okay. Thank you, Karsten. Let's move on to another one here. This one's for Prob. It looks like people are looking for examples. Prob, what is one interesting new medical product design that you've seen in your innovative products to miniaturize the design?
Yeah, one example that stands out is for lab automation. There was advanced pipette control where they wanted to embed this card, it's a single axis card, at the end of each pipette, which did pretty sophisticated motion. And it was a full-blown controller, which is our 56-pin device, and we provided a reference design for a discrete amplifier. So they were able to fit all of that into like a 15 by 15 millimeter form factor and put in an optical encoder. And what they ended up doing is taking that miniaturized design and using it in multiple places. So it almost becomes like a common motion kind of card that they tend to use across designs. and they would do a one-axis and then slowly migrate and use it in lots of different designs. The other example, which is not tied to miniaturization, but what I've seen is, especially with COVID, there was a huge push for new ventilator designs. So we had done some. So we'd actually worked with a few startups that wanted to try to get to market a lot quicker. So they were able to take these development kits and prototype their whole setup, and then in parallel kind of create their own card. And obviously cost becomes a priority there. And so we've also worked with them on new advanced control techniques for stepper motors, which are cheaper, with closed loop steppers with an encoder. There's a lot of techniques to kind of balance your different axes, right? You have the power, the weight, and the cost. So it's trying to get to the sweet spot.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Prab. Here's a great question. I really like this one. If he hadn't have asked it, I would have asked it myself, I think. Can 3D printing be considered an alternative to micro-molding small runs? Aaron, that's obviously for you.
You know, if you'd asked me that question a year or so ago, I would say it would be very challenging. It's a market space that I have kept an eye on for a very long time because I think it can help enable that design process, getting to where you need to go faster. So we've been looking for and wanting to see that market match some of the resolutions that our customers often find they need for molding. So the short answer is yes. I think there's about 3-ish companies. There's a few that are working on some things that I'm aware of that I think can do a fantastic job if you're looking for short-run micro components with high precision. I'll go ahead and name them. NanoScribe, NanoFabrica, and BMF are 3 that they all have a slightly different approach to their processing, but what I've seen is very encouraging when it comes to the quality, precision nature of 3D printing and how it could be complementary to your design process to a full, plastic manufacturing process.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Aaron. Great question. Let's go to this one. This would probably be for Karsten again. Is there any new revolutionary technology that's coming to miniature motors which would soon change the entire industry and be crucial to the future of electric miniature motors?
That would be great. Unfortunately, not that I'm aware of that there is something like that around. Mostly what we have seen over the years is improvement, step by step, getting better every year, and getting smaller every year. And that's the main factor. What is a little bit a driving factor or had been a disruptive technology is the higher integration that is going with. If you go smaller and try to miniaturize everything, interfaces are getting more and more in the focus. If you have components, then you sometimes have to double interfaces, for example, like bearing systems on the input side of anything. And sometimes it makes sense to just reduce the number of components that you need. And this is only possible if you do a higher integration. And that's typical-wise what we see at the moment as a more disruptive development. So customers start with some samples, do their feasibility studies, and then start to scale it down and size it down, and then you quickly come to the point where you see, okay, wow, yeah, I have some redundancies in my system, I need to get rid of them. That's typical-wise the first step, and that's typical-wise then higher integration. For example, that blood support pump you have seen down there, you could maybe produce that with a sealing system and then have an impeller on top of that, or you make it as an open system where you just have a rotor and a stator, and this is free-flowing. By that, for example, you just reduce the number of interfaces, in this case, the complete steering system out there. So you can save a lot of space down there. That's getting relevant if you get really small out there.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Karsten. Another one here, I'm not exactly sure I understand this, but I'm going to do my best with this question. As a robotics and automation equipment provider for medical devices, we are continuously challenged with automated assembly, because of miniaturization, have you seen a trend to revert back to more manual / operator assembly methods instead of automation? I guess that would be for Prob, or maybe that would be for Carson. I don't know. Who wants to grab that one?
Yeah, I think probably for Aaron too. Yeah, we see that when we create our drives, if it's a smaller form factor than can be traditionally handled by contract manufacturers, we sometimes lean towards having internal manual assembly of some of the components, some of the process steps. But what we've seen is it's all driven by the volumes. So if the volumes are high enough, we have to figure out a way through an automated step. So that's what we typically see. If it's a lower volume, like 100 units or less, then doing the manual operation is fine. But anything higher, the failure rates go up, and so you tend to look at how to automate the whole process. I don't know if Aaron or Carson want to add in a bit to it.
Aaron, I can jump in. The very small 800 micron part that Chuck showed earlier, the actual challenge with that wasn't the molding, it was the handling. So in one sense, yes, there can be a challenge in just manipulating these micro-sized components, but it is a challenge that is solvable, at least in the efforts that we've seen in putting things together. But exactly as was mentioned, the lower volume, that tends to be more manual anyway. But challenge, yes, part of the conversation. In fact, we sometimes provide those miniature parts, those sub-millimeter parts on the runner so they can be handled by automation, and maybe they're degated at the manufacturing process. So it's just got to be part of the design effort when you're looking at starting a project like this.
Okay, Carson, did you want to go after this one? Or?
Yeah, let me add that a little bit. So I can only say the same thing like Prab and Aaron is yes, if things get smaller, the handling is getting much more trickier. And of course, automatization gives you a big opportunity here. As you know, machines can be done pretty precisely to handle these extremely small parts. I need to add that typical-wise, if you go smaller, there is another thing that need to be taken in consideration. That is that the cleanness of the surrounding is getting very important. If you have parts like Aaron in that size, you need to handle them in a clean room that has at least 100,000 class minimum, because otherwise dust and dirt now getting really a challenge for you. If you have something like that, this is getting much more tricky. And this is sometimes a much more driving factor, for example, than the volume is the dirt. And humans, typical-wise, we generate dirt and dust, like parts from the hair, from skin out there. And if these are landing into your mechanical components or also in your electronic components, you have a big problem out there, because this can lead to some really unwanted effects when you go very, very small. And then sometimes it is better to automatize just because of this fact, because otherwise your failure rate will increase dramatically.
Okay, thank you, Carson. All right, another excellent question here. I like this one. What are the timelines for, this is obviously, by the way, for Aaron, what are the timelines for producing a micro mold? For example, the tube replacement you showed on the simple side, and then a more complex object.
Yeah, that's a common question. I can tell you the average, our average tooling time is 4 to 6 weeks. But if you're getting into the more complex, certainly you can push that maybe to the 7 or 8 week mark, especially if there's molded optics as part of the tool build or insert or over molding. And then if you're adding like a multi-cavity system that's also very complex, you're talking maybe even a little bit further than that. But it can be fairly quick, at least in our estimation, and we're pushing our tool team to go faster. We've done some fantastic work in just a few weeks. So again, I think the 4 to 6 weeks is probably a safe average.
Okay. All right, thank you, Aaron. Another question here. This would definitely be for Prob. Is motion control used in corporal? And then he puts a little note here, seems too big. Prab, do you want to try and handle that one?
Yeah, typically we've seen them on the outside, but like Carson showed an example of for surgical robotics, we've seen cases where surgical tooltips have like a torque or velocity controller, simple control IC embedded in the tooltip. So we've seen both ways. Traditionally, like the infusion pumps and ventilators and stuff are outside, but we're starting to see a trend of incorporeal kind of designs that are looking at a little bit more sophisticated motion control and embedding these tiny ICs in the device. Carson, if you want to add something.
Yes, what we have seen, especially, for example, in the surgical robots, you have seen Chuck's slides before. These are all excorporeal ones, but of course there are also incorporeal ones that are very super small, tiny robots that go to one insertion and then unfold inside the body. And these robots typical-wise have the full motion control on board, means they are within of the drives down there. Of course, this is a challenge in itself, but this is we see this as a trend because some of the super small surgical robots they need to be super precise and everything that you need from a motion control point of view. So having the right trajectories available, predicting where they want to go or where they can't go, it's really a challenge in itself. And this is driving then also the factor that you want to go only to a very small insertion. And then you need to have the electronics on board with the motor itself, especially if you have a ton of sensors that are typically going with this sort of robots down there. And you can't bring a bundle of cable out there, for example, like for the camera system, the light system, then all the sensor signals down there. You try to handle that locally. So very locally on the function we are working on. We see this as a trend, and yes, this is much more implantable electronics in the near future, definitely.
Okay. All right, thank you both. All right, we have time for one more question. It's going to have to be a real quick one here. But this listener says, you never mentioned about sensors. What is the projection for using the most advanced sensors for feedback to improve the sufficiency of the miniature motors? Carson, I guess that's you.
Very good question, and ash on my head that I don't talk about that before. Of course, sensors are one of the most advanced stuff and development thing in this sort of field. It's not only positioning, it's sensing forces, it's sensing humidity, temperatures out there. There's a ton of that. And yes, the miniaturization of the sensors makes things like an in-body robot possible. Without that, it wouldn't be completely impossible. So what means sometimes that you need to go down to the die size and bond it down there on a ceramic, that you really can have the size down there. But we didn't mention it because sensors are coming out of the electronic devices, like the semiconductor industry, and they tend to be getting smaller. I don't know, I think they are scaling down in factors like 10 every few years. So that was really why I didn't mention it. But yes, this is a driving factor, definitely. And the small, super advanced sensors down there make things like in-body robots. Without them, it would be impossible.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would add is...
Yeah, go ahead, Prab.
Yeah, so we're also seeing trends in more advanced sensors like sine, cosine, encoder, like more sophisticated sensing, more precision, like Carson was mentioning, and making them smaller. So we have one example where, like Carson mentioned, they have a pressure sensor for force touch, so you know when you reach the position, and then they switch over to like a sine cosine encoder. So there's a lot of advanced encoder technologies that are getting embedded in the motor, in the controls part of it. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Prab. Thank you, Karsten. And thank you, Aaron. I'm going to hand it back now to Chris. Chris, you want to jump in?
All right, thank you, Chuck. That is all the time that we have for questions for today. I'd like to thank Aaron, Carson, and Prab for their participation and their expertise on today's topic. And also, if we didn't get to your question today, someone will get back to you after the program is over. Also like to thank our sponsors, which are Accumold and also Maxon, and of course, Performance Motion Devices, as well as everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and your participation today. And within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to today's event. This webinar is copyright 2020 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyright by Informa Markets, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of our guests, I'm Chris Keach. Once again, we'd like to thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.